Athenian origins of citizens' assemblies. So this should be live in a second. The Athenian or okay, and I'm going to turn this to speaker view. I think I like that better. Okay. So we are live now, and I can introduce you. Okay. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to go to Brussels and meet somebody who I think he's recently moved to Brussels. He's now the Chief of External Affairs at ACLEB, which I really want to know more about soon. This is Hugh Pope, and he is the reason I'm wanting to interview about him is that I want to talk about his father's book. And in a way, you can almost call it his book because he took off a couple of years from his own career to edit and publish a manuscript that he found that his father had written many years before. And of course, his father's passed on. So he spent 2 years of his life working on cleaning up this manuscript and getting it out and publicizing it. So we really want to talk about that book. I think I read it about a year ago, or at least several months ago, and it was the best book I'd read all year. And I go around talking to people about it, and I think I'm a little weird to believe in this thing. But it's called The Keys to Democracy, or Keys to Democracy, I don't know. And this is Hugh Pope, and I want to say hello, Hugh Pope.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Meta. It's a great privilege to join someone who cares about these things. It's as you say, it's not a subject that most people go into. Most people think that democracy is democracy. What are you talking about? But as you say, when I started reading this book, I began to see things a bit differently. Yeah.
Well, but you were with your father or in his vicinity when he was writing the book. And my impression from something I read, maybe, or I don't know, maybe I watched a video of you or something. And I think that in those days, everybody did think that maybe they wouldn't call him a crackpot because he was a very distinguished professor at Oxford, but classics. So he wasn't a crackpot. But the idea of using direct democracy of people, ordinary citizens running their own government was considered so bizarre and unrealistic that that he wasn't taken very seriously, was he? Am I mistaken?
You're absolutely right that he was a quite successful academic author, wrote fairly well-read general books on things like the history of decipherment of ancient languages and about ancient Greece and so forth. But his work on democracy, which was something that he did out of his own interest rather than any teaching courses, was something that took people by surprise at the time. I think if you were to go to Switzerland, for instance, where they have a much more direct democracy, it would be considered less outlandish. And if you had been in the 18th century, people would have understood exactly what you were talking about. But it's true that for the last 200 years, most people have associated the word democracy with elections, which is it's a bit like a cuckoo in the nest. It's not how it was seen by the Greeks. It was not how it was seen by the people of the Enlightenment, it was stripping away some of the misunderstandings that there have been about democracy. But oddly enough, Meta, he wasn't alone. There were other people in the United States, in Germany, who were experimenting with ideas of random selection to try and surface public opinion, to try and work out a better version of how you know what people want. And in fact, two of them created very successful institutes, and one in Germany, which was it was a kind, they were called planning cells, and this turned into a really useful tool for working out, usually used in local government, and it really caught on in Japan as well. And in the United States, there was another group of people who worked on something very similar. And the fascinating thing is that in those pre-internet days, they didn't know they were doing it. And when they heard about each other, they became fast friends. And there was yet another one in California who was using it very successfully and internationally, using deliberation as and random selection deliberation to solve public policy issues. But he wasn't using it. They were using it to advise governments, very much to advise governments, and as a sort of as a better sort of public opinion polling. So there were. I guess the truth is that no one ever has an original idea. It's just when the seed falls in the right soil, it sprouts. But people were thinking of, gosh, it's our elections and representative government really the acme of human achievement in terms of self, how we administer ourselves, how we find out what the best course of action is. And many people were feeling frustrated by the party politics and the way that elections turn out such inefficient and unproductive governments, that it was definitely something that people were worried about. I mean, because what happens with representative electoral democracy is that most people follow Winston Churchill in saying, well, yes, it's not perfect, but it's, of all the bad forms of government there are, this is the best one, which has always seemed to me a rather sort of weak argument.
Well, I think it's a realistic argument if you're talking about democracy, what he meant by democracy. He wasn't referring to direct democracy or Athenian democracy or citizens' assemblies, as we would call it today. He was
not at all. No, I mean the word democracy for someone like my father, who was in some ways very old-fashioned, and that I think he truly believed that Athenian random selection and what they called democracy were the same thing, and that all the use of the word democracy that arose in the 19th century to mean this parliamentary representation was a complete fraud. And he also looked at the situation that the Greeks found themselves. He spent his whole working life thinking about the achievements of Greece, and the Greeks themselves, who were no lack of hubris there, they believed themselves to be a highly civilized group of people, even though by our standards, of course, their democracy left out huge sections of the population. I mean, they did not include women, did not include slaves, did not include foreigners. So anything that would be done today would be done very differently to Greece, but still, in terms of the proportion of the population involved in actual government, this was one of the largest catchments of participants that has ever happened. And that's what the Greeks actually attributed their enormous success in all the fields of activity that they had, in philosophy and in drama, in mathematics and history writing. I mean, almost all these branches of the sciences that the Greeks invented, and the huge number of Greek thinkers that even today are remembered, which is far above any other society. And I'm just going back to say it again. They thought that it was their system of government that liberated this energy.
I wouldn't quarrel with them. I think, it's certainly worth investigating and thinking about. Sure. and which is, there are lessons to be drawn from that. And of course, today that may be why there's a resurgence of interest in direct democracy, or well, let's call it real democracy. I'll follow your father's opinions on this, and call it real democracy, or at least Athenian democracy. Because I lie awake at night worrying about what's going to come. I mean, I think Trump it's not I mean, everybody knows Trump is ahead. He's going to get reelected, most likely. At least it's a very real possibility. And you see these right-wing movements all around the world. I'm taking a little heart that last week Modi got his comeuppance, and I think isn't it tomorrow that there are European elections to the European Parliament? Let's see what
Yes.
happens then. What do
Yes,
you expect then?
yes, I'm voting tomorrow as a good Belgian. I have to go to my local school and cast a vote. It's only the second time in my life that I actually cast a vote. Somehow, when I was brought up by someone who didn't believe in elections, somehow it's almost like with my mother's milk. I didn't believe in this form of government, but here it's obligatory to vote, which is fine. If you're going to have representative government, I think it's right. It should be obligatory. You should have to vote, because otherwise it's not really representative. It's not even it's not intellectually pure at all. But I would say that people are interested in these new forms of government, as you say, but not just ancient Athenian style randomly selected government, or sortition-based government, as it would be technically called. But even young people are interested in more authoritarian solutions, not unlike ancient Greece. I mean, democracy in its Greek sense was not the only form of government in the ancient Greek world. They had tyrannies, monarchies, oligarchies, and the like, that were also competing for being the way people ran their affairs. And because of the failures of representative democracy or parliamentary democracy, which everyone can see are producing political dynasties and political parties that people don't see themselves in, and wars and inefficient solutions, they are attracted to the idea that perhaps authoritarian rule is the way to do it. I mean, the way that China does things, it's not a single person ruler, but it's very authoritarian, and that some people are attracted to that as well. So I think there is a market of ideas out there. I think people are offering new ways of doing things, and people are beginning to look at them because, to be honest with you, I think that the fact that it's not just one of the leaders seems to be how can I put this politely? But I think the choice on offer in a country like the United States is very limited, and I think it's become an almost a classic example of how representative government has gone into a dead end, where a few tens of thousands of votes in a few swing states are going to make such a huge difference into the way a country, which both you and I know is a perfectly reasonable country full of perfectly reasonable people, perfectly able to take reasonable decisions about the way to do things, have got stuck with these two very imperfect choices.
Oh, very, yeah. Okay. Well, okay. So we should a little bit talk about what the Greeks actually did. I have this image of people getting, of course, it's my fantasy, but it's the closest we have to anything similar is the notion of jury duty. That if you get called, as any citizen will be at some time, you're supposed to go and you do a very important work in deciding very important things. And it's as if you get your jury duty call in Athens that on a certain day you're supposed to go be the government or be part of the government. And you go down there, and then there's somebody having a clipboard and saying, well, now you go over to that room and you're on that committee. And you go this over here, and now you're going to run the government today. How did it really work? This is my fantasy.
Well, again, it was imperfect for those of us who would have, like my father, who would have had the whole population having to respond to the call of duty to about a week a month, a week a year. At some level of government, they would be called up. In his book, that's how he sees it. How the ancient Greeks did it was different. How we do jury service is different, and how the experiments in random selection today are doing it in citizen assemblies is also a bit different. But let's go to the Greek version, where, as I said, only the men and the citizen men were eligible, and they could turn up to be chosen. I think it was an annual thing. About 6,000 people were chosen to be able to present themselves every year, and then those who wanted to could
Excuse
go.
me, those are all citizens. Now that's 6,000 out of a pool of how many? I mean,
About
how do you
30,000.
30,000?
30,000 people, but no one really knows. There was no census. There was no full census in Athens.
Well, there was
And
no citizenship as such, or were
yes,
they?
very strict citizenship. It was very hard to be a citizen of Athens.
So were these 30,000 the citizens, or
Yes. Oh,
the
hang on. I think that's the population. So,
population? So,
but
but
nobody.
the 6,000 were from what kind of pool?
Well, I suspect not much more than 6,000. I mean, I think that
I
if
yeah,
the
almost.
population of Athens was 30,000, 15,000 of them would have been
Mhm.
men, and then so perhaps. Do you know what, Meta? I don't know uh, the exact way you got from the pool of men of Athens, citizen men of Athens, to the 6,000 that were given access to the system every year, and I'm not sure if that was drawn by lot. What I do know is that those who wished to turn up for service, turned up in the morning, presented their names written on a little slip of pottery, I believe, and it went into a stone machine called a cleriterion, and then the rows would you were from one of 10 themes, as they called it, sort of artificial tribes of Athens. It was you were assigned a notional tribe, and the and that put you in one of the columns, and then balls would be dropped down the side of the stone, and we think it was white and black balls, for instance. And when the right colored ball landed on the row that you were on, you would be assigned to that to your 10 people would be assigned to, as you say, to jury duty or to government duty, and then within the sub assemblies, say there was a ruling council of about 50 people, they would also choose a leader of Athens every day by lot. So for 24 hours, there would be one person that would be in theoretical overall
I think
notional.
a 24-hour mayorship. Is that
Yes,
right?
yes, but
What?
it would be part of a 50-person upper group, as it were. But again, this is chosen by lot, and the details are perhaps less important than the principle was that you never knew who it was going to be, so you wouldn't know who to bribe, and the other principle that's very important is that you were swayed by arguments. You only represented yourself. You didn't. You hadn't come to the assembly as the representative of a part of Athens. You could think like that, personally, but it wasn't you had no obligation to do that, which is very different from representative democracy, where it's a classic problem that if you're elected from Toronto, say, do you represent the people of Toronto? Do you represent the people who elected you in Toronto? Do you represent Canada, or do you represent your own conscience?
Or
And
do you
if
represent your party?
or your party, exactly, yeah.
Hmm.
Or the people who gave you the money that enabled you to stand in the election. And I have to say that these philosophical differences make a huge change, because I've been lucky enough to attend citizen assemblies that are the modern version of what the Athenians were doing. And if I sounded a bit hazy on it, is that I don't think anybody actually knows precisely how it worked. But we'll get with the ancient, classicists have a pretty good idea. But and of course, we wouldn't do it the same way exactly the same way the Athenians did it anyway, because we're a bit different. But another principle that, let me just go to the citizens' assemblies that I have attended, where people are truly liberated by this feeling that I have been chosen. I'm just as worthy as the other 50, 150 people that are alongside me. And I will do my best during the days that I have to work on this problem, to inform myself, to adjudicate between the experts who are briefing me, and then to do my best to work out what everyone else is thinking, and then to, working together, choose various ideas and recommendations on the way forward. And so that sense of individual conscience being the prime driver of decision making, and of course a proper sifting of the information. In Athens, they would have done it with orators explaining the situation, but they would also obviously have a public service, and there would be public opinion as well. People would have a chance to hear various sides of a question and then make up their own minds. And I think that's something that is almost absent in it's not absent from representative democracy, in the sense we do have public opinion and people are swayed by events and so forth, but the inefficiency of it is extreme, and the polarization that comes from the parties fighting each other, and the fact that people only get elected if they have money or money behind them, are very distorting to the clarity of decision making that's possible.
Well,
with
I don't think you're going to have anybody who will argue with you when you're talking about the flaws in representative democracy today. Everybody can see that something's gone wrong, or it doesn't take very long if you're arguing with somebody to convince them, yes, democracy as we know it is sort of broken. It's not working right. And maybe it can't be fixed. I don't know. But the other side of it is, if you try to argue, well, alternatively, shall we go for a system where ordinary people, including the delivery man and the waitress and so on, everybody has an equal voice in making decisions for the whole country or the world. You're going to get arguments about that, and I have to join them too, because I have strong questions about whether or not human beings nowadays are smart enough to make good decisions. Otherwise, why would we have all these stupid political decisions and conflicts that are going on now, where people are supporting basically fascists? So the evidence runs in both directions. But on the other hand, when I see the results of actual citizens' assemblies, where they take cross-section of the population and bring them together to deliberate, I'm sort of impressed. Now, tell me what you think about the current studies or efforts to do that, because it's very common now. It's becoming quite a thing. They're not doing it regularly to give the the Citizens Assembly the right to control the government policy. They're not really a wing of government, but they certainly give advice. And how do you think that the evidence shows how they're doing on that score?
What's happened is that, as I mentioned earlier on, there was a kind of first phase in which people like my father, who was sitting in his library in Oxford, writing literally theoretically, not even citing other people who were working on the same thing, because people just didn't know of each other. And you had this first phase of in several countries of people using random selection, experimenting with random selection, sometimes with commercial success, as a decision-making crutch, as a way to help people coming to a new way to make decisions, or to inform decisions. Then in the 2000s, actually, the first one to be properly documented was actually in British Columbia. There was a citizens' assembly on electoral reform, and there was another one, I think, in Ontario, quite soon afterwards. And these are the first two citizens' assemblies that brought together people with the explicit idea of independently giving advice, and which would then go to a referendum. So a kind of assisted direct democracy. This kind of citizens' assembly has proved really popular, and the first one in British Columbia was about 2003. But if you fast forward to 2013, say, between 2013 and now, there have been several hundred citizens' assemblies. I think we're on about 800 now that have taken place, and they are being used especially on knotty issues that governments feel a little feel unable to take long-term decisions because they are politically costly.
Like abortion in Ireland.
Like abortion in Ireland, like same-sex marriage in Ireland, like euthanasia in France. In Holland, a number of municipalities have looked at ways to take decisions. For instance, the expansion of a nuclear plant in the Netherlands, they took it to the local people and said, okay, under what conditions, let's look at, we need this electricity as a country. You already have a nuclear power station in here. We're thinking of expanding it. Under what conditions would that work for you here? And they came up with new ideas that satisfied the local people, took their views into account, and also got the country more in, potentially it hasn't been built yet, but the way it would be built would satisfy local opinion. The local people felt that they'd had a voice in it. In their case, they suggested making the housing that would be made available to the workers to build that nuclear plant. They said, well, if you make that housing stock over to us when you've done it, then okay. So not the solution that any planner would have thought up, or would have. It's not really about someone having a miraculously good plan. The point is that the people themselves felt as though they'd contributed, and this is what I mean. I think a remarkable achievement. And in Germany, the Bundestag, or the Parliament, has now commissioned 3 big citizens' assemblies to work on slightly less earth-moving topics, I think, including things like I think nutrition is one of them, but also other experiments in Germany where the constituencies of MPs are being mobilized into citizens' assemblies to try and advise the MPs what local people think on topics in general, and then giving advice to local MPs. And local MPs are not necessarily ogres, and they have according to people that I've met who work on these constituency level citizens assemblies that are working out what people think are the most important things for their MP to do, it's like a supercharging of representative government. The MPs are very happy to be briefed by these citizens assemblies because they say it's the first time that they've actually dealt with non-interest group based advice, because most people are only interested in parking spaces and things that affect them personally. But here the citizens assemblies were channeling that wish that I believe most people have of working for the public good, and something that gets very easily lost in representative government.
Well, how many of these citizens assemblies have actually found their policies being adopted by the official government? And is there any case in which the government has promised at the outset that when they form these citizens assembly, they tell them, you make the decision and we promise we'll take your word for whatever you decide, we will implement it. Does that ever happen? And how often do governments go ahead and adopt the recommendations?
It's very early days for citizens assemblies. We're quite niche in talking about it. It's not considered a natural step to do what the citizens assemblies say. And unfortunately, I think there are still too few cases in which the advice of citizens assemblies has been taken. In Canada, for instance, those first two citizens assemblies were set very high bars. They came up with very reasonable solutions for electoral reform, but they required the referendum afterwards, at least in the case of I think both cases, was so high that they didn't get over it. It was like 60% of the population had to vote for it. The success cases that you mentioned are real, but it was they were not quite flukes in the sense, but it was the result of a process that was designed. So in Ireland, as you say, a constitutional reform citizens assembly did suggest allowing abortion, which in a Catholic country like Ireland was almost impossible for politicians to address. And thanks to the very public deliberations and the very good sense of the committee and the integration of politicians in the process, they did manage to come up with a recommendation that the politicians of the time did adopt and put to referendum. They were not obliged to. And so, yes, in the movement for citizens assemblies, these two are these two cases from the same-sex marriage as well are the poster children. But unfortunately, for instance, in Iceland, where they had a kind of slightly less than random selection of their citizens assembly, the government changed halfway through, and all the recommendations got lost. In the climate assembly in France, under President Macron has had they've done two already, and the first one was climate to discuss what should France do on climate change, and it was extremely well organized by the standards of things. And the president promised that he would allow whatever the Citizens Assembly decided to go through without a filter. But when push came to shove, he didn't allow it to go through, and there were reasons for that. One of them being that the Parliament felt as though its rights had been infringed, in the sense that it was the constitutional decision-making assembly, and it didn't feel that it had to take the decisions suggested by the Citizens Assembly as its template. So of the 150 recommendations of the Citizens Assembly, only about 10% got through. However, the discussions and the consensus that was achieved have shifted the argument in France. And I think we won't know the exact contribution of that Citizens Assembly until academics go over the whole journey that France is on in terms of dealing with climate adaptation, climate change.
Has have the deliberations been publicized? I mean, I think the beautiful thing about the Citizens Assembly that really makes it quite different from just assuming that a referendum would be the equivalent of somebody, you could hold a referendum and everybody go in and without having thought or studied the issue in advance, just vote. And of course, they may not have worked it out, all the problems, but with the deliberation in advance, and of course, I think that's another question: how much deliberation is required, and how do you know how much is required when setting it up? But yeah, tell me about that. Let's just go into that question. How much deliberation is required for a citizens assembly to be doing its optimum production?
This is a very live question in the movement for sortition or randomly selected government. In theory, there should be no need for it, because if you had a jury style selection of people in a citizens assembly, as my father's book, The Keys to Democracy, would advocate, you would have achieved a representative sample of the population. There would be no need to go to the second step of having a referendum, for exactly the reasons that you describe or suggest or imply, that the population as a whole has not gone through that process of informing itself, deliberating, coming to a compromise with the people who think differently, thanks to the trust that is built up during these citizens' assemblies. A remarkable thing, and I would love to talk a bit about what it's like to be in a citizens' assembly. Once you the citizens' assemblies that we've had so far, I think in Ireland it was quite well publicized, and people did see it. Some academic studies of the French discussions showed that many people were aware of them, and partly because President Macron chose this route of citizens' assemblies because he had just been shocked by the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement that had sort of revolutionary overtones, and part of his way of meeting the yellow vests halfway was to have lots of assemblies all around the country, some of which were actually randomly selected. Most of them were just sort of town hall style meetings, but there was a kind of people's voice. People were looking for information, but up till now, as I said, few of the recommendations have been taken forward. Even in France, where last year the Citizens Assembly that I attended on euthanasia came up with a very clear recommendation. President Macron received the Citizens Assembly and said he would make a law out of based on what they recommended. That was in April last year. It is still promised imminently, but I believe it still has not actually hit the Assembly yet. And when it does, how much of what the Assembly discussed, which was in terms of availability of the information, yes, the information sessions were all live streamed. You can go onto if you speak French, you can go onto the website and see all the information that they got. They had 60 experts briefing them. You can get a flavor of it, but it is not, how can I say, it's not integrated, and it's very difficult to integrate in what people living their daily lives do, in the same way that if you were having a jury trial about a fraud case or a murder or something, you couldn't sort of step in at the end as a juryman or late jurywoman and vote with any legitimacy if you hadn't been part of the process by which the rest of the jury had reached their decision. So yeah, it's a kind of how do you say, it's putting apples and pears together in my view, but for the time being, we're in a transition period. So people are experimenting with all different kinds of combinations of it. And one in Oregon is very interesting in that there, if you have a referendum on a topic, which as a person, I'm also British, and obviously Brexit, the way that the Brexit decision was taken by 52% of the population on the basis of completely fraudulent information is a classic case of how a decision can be made by the population that appears legitimate by the numbers, but is illegitimate in the sense that people were voting for all kinds of reasons that had nothing to do with Europe. And now Britain is stuck with the decision. It will survive, I suppose, but very suboptimal situation brought on by the fact that that the population wasn't really completely involved in the subject at hand. And going back to Oregon, when you have a referendum there, they have a kind of a panel that is randomly selected will meet to discuss the issue at hand and will produce a recommendation sheet that will be available to anyone going into the polling booth to say, we, of the randomly selected group of people in Oregon, think that this is what the issue is. This is what you are voting for, and the choice is yours, but we think this. How much influence that has on the individual voters of Oregon, I don't know when these things come up, but it seems to me a better use of the Citizens' Assembly than one of the good uses of the Citizens' Assembly, as opposed to having a purely expecting people to have been watching everything going on in the Assembly, and also expecting people to feel the same sense of commonality with the other side that people who are in an assembly do feel. And therefore their readiness to accept a compromise solution is absent if you just go direct to a referendum.
Yes, but I have the impression that there are citizens' assemblies that meet for a weekend, and there are citizens' assemblies that meet for 6 months. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but not much. I mean, how long? How do they decide how long is optimal? And and also there's the other thing, somebody's got to organize the whole thing and present the original case to the members and select. Somehow people have to select speakers that they would like to come and talk to them and explain things to them. Now, the people organizing the event must do some of that work in advance, and it can't just be the outcome of the participants themselves, the citizens as they gather. It must be orchestrated to some extent by people who have a something at stake in the outcome and want one outcome rather than another. So to what extent can you say that this is truly the result of the deliberations of the citizens as opposed to the people who set it up for them?
I think the issue that people discuss is fairly clear. I mean, the critical point of a citizen assembly is in the phrasing of the question that is being answered. It must be relevant to the community. It must be something that a community of people can really control and change. And the formulation of that question, as you say, is not necessarily the citizens themselves. Ideally, it is the a governmental body that mandates it and then takes responsibility for, as you say, promising to implement it when it comes out. So I think that the outcome of a question can't be prejudged, but obviously the nature of the question can rule out some parts of the problem. So it's very important that the question be relevant and complete, and that it doesn't leave parts of the situation out. And so it would have to be a non-political body, a non-partisan body must be the one that does that formulation. In the case of France, when they do a citizens' assembly, it costs a lot of money, a lot of time. They do, as you say, a lengthy. They have nine. The euthanasia one had 9 weekends. Ideally, if you've organized a citizens' assembly, you need at least 4 days. There are some manuals of good practice. Anyone listening in could go to, for instance, the website of Democracy Next, where they have a guide to making your own citizens' assembly, and what you would need in order to fulfill all the criteria that you rightly point to, the problems of who's organizing it, how will we get money, who's going to implement it. I mean, all these things have to be thought through, but normally the problem is something that everyone knows about. Say, for instance, forest fires in Canada. What can we do? These are things you wouldn't have a citizens' assembly on, how to deal with the problem of having mice in kitchens. I mean, that would not be appropriate. It needs to be a question that demands some kind of popular compromise, some resharing of resources, some new way of doing things, and perhaps overcoming major interest groups who might not want to do things like, let's say, in terms of forest fires, you might come up with a climate change suggestion, which to do that kind of thing, you need to bring everyone along with you, but it needs to be plausible. The actual facilitation of a citizens' assembly is also critical, and so you need an experienced organizer. In Canada, you have a wonderful organization, and again, lots of resources on their website, Mass LBP.
We did a show with them.
Yes, Pete, very interesting, and they are pioneers in citizens' assemblies, and they have huge experience. They were involved from the beginning, and in fact, the main meeting of the citizens' assemblies movement, or the sortition movement, is happening in Vancouver this year, partly as a result in September, so there are national groups that are specialized in citizen assemblies like them. There are others. There's a Sortition Foundation in Britain, which also has ambitions in Europe. There is here in Belgium, there's something called the G1000, which started 15 years ago. Wonderful people working there, and Belgium has actually got permanent citizens assemblies running parts of its government. It's still early days. There's still parts of the government that are not necessarily essential, and the Belgian government is a fairly philosophical entity anyway. But these are things that people would not have imagined 15 years ago could be possible. But things have changed. Things are changing, and in each national case
that intrigues me. Belgium with its 2 populations and almost like 2 different states. Do they, if you have a citizens' assembly for the whole country, I assume that you bring in both French and Flemish-speaking citizens, and do you make an effort to? I mean, how much of a problem is that for Belgium?
Yeah, well, Belgian government is extremely complicated, and I don't think anybody understands it completely. But in some cases, some bodies have sought to expand their legitimacy and credibility by using elements of random selection. For instance, in the first permanent citizens' assembly is the upper house of the German-speaking community, which is tiny. It's 60,000-80,000 people in the east of the country on the German border. It's not even it doesn't even have its own federal area, but it's part of the French-speaking federal state of Belgium. We're three federal states in Belgium. The Wallonians who speak Flemish or Dutch, and the Wallonians who speak the Walloons who speak French, and the German-speaking community is part of the French state area. But still, they have a system whereby the upper house has a citizens' assembly that is chosen for 18 months, which then subcontracts does the formulation of the issues to be addressed by sub-citizens' assemblies, which are convened for a much shorter period to discuss the issues of healthcare or schooling that people think require a long-term solution. And it's going. I'm not sure that every German-speaking citizen of Belgium knows exactly how this works, but it's there. And in Brussels, here we're a separate federal state of Brussels, which is a city of 1,200,000 people or so, and divided into language communities again, because it's Belgium. But one of the houses of parliament in Brussels, the French-speaking House of Parliament, had an extraordinary realization that the people and the parliament were just drifting apart, that people were just not turning up to vote and were not interested, and the politicians were losing touch. And the president of the parliament decided to counteract that by another form of citizens' assembly or random selection, by adding randomly selected citizens to the standing committees when they discussed important topics.
Oh, yeah.
And
okay.
it had a real impact in making people feel that they had something to do with government, instead of, as you put it earlier, instead of having these dozens of political parties blindly whacking each other and reaching complex governing protocols, if they could, that had nothing to do with what people wanted, but only the interests of these very narrow-based political parties. And political parties are only joined by 2 or 3% of the population maximum for all the political parties. And in Britain, the Conservative Party currently is just 100,000 people or so, and they choose the prime minister, and it's almost something that you'd think from the 17th century, with sort of rotten boroughs and.
Didn't know that. No.
Yeah, it's the system of representative government we have it's almost as if we're still using horses and carriages on things, when we could be doing things in such a sophisticated way.
Okay, now how about this? I mean, to me, it doesn't make any difference whether I go to your living room and sit with you and had this conversation, or whether we do it at our screens. And I have exactly the same relationship with you now that I would have if I'd been to visit you in person. So I think we could have citizens' assemblies by Zoom.
That is what Americans think. There are some people that take randomly selected people to meet members of Congress or the Senates, and they do it in 1 hour. It's because time is everything, as we know, in productive America and the productive United States, and so they feel that they can distill it down that way. But I think we should remember that some issues are bigger than that, and I do think that one needs to take into account that if you have the time and if you have the money, it is very useful for people to come together in the same space and be together and get to know each other. And most citizens' assemblies make a first phase, perhaps a quarter of the time, perhaps an eighth of the time. But anyway, a very important first phase is getting people to know each other. And that is much more easily done in person than on screen. And the reason for this is that a huge part of reaching a good common sense decision is mutual trust. And as you were saying earlier, the populations have become so polarized that they dismiss almost anything the other side says because it's coming from them. However, if you're in someone's living room, as you put it, you feel you realize that 80% of the things that they're saying are actually what you would say, and the things you disagree about are actually a very small proportion of what you would normally think about. You know, how to fry an egg and or what should be done with the front lawn and so forth. And so, in fact, cumulatively, you feel a sense of common purpose with that person, and therefore are much more ready to uh, to reach out and find out what, for instance, should we do about euthanasia, which is a very,
Well, look, I
very,
have done, as I mentioned, this is number 609 of my series of talk shows, if you will, or forums. And so I've talked to a lot of people in that time. Often, usually it's two or three people in a conversation. And I honestly feel that it doesn't make any difference whether I was with them in person or not. I get to know them as well as I would have in a situation before there was Zoom. I now some people just hate videos or this kind of technology and feel that well, I remember Doug Roach said he doesn't feel right unless he gets a chance to hug the person. So the one thing you can't do is you hug anybody, but everything else I think is just as good. So I'm really of the opinion that it wouldn't be difficult at all to host a citizens assembly simply by Zoom. And I
yeah.
think it would be meaningful. I really do.
I think you would get somewhere towards it, but I think on your Zoom calls, you're not reaching policy decisions. And ideally, that's what a citizens assembly is going to do. And it, at a certain point, everyone has to make a leap of faith.
Why don't I try it?
Well,
I can do it. I'll try it. I don't know how to
yeah,
get my base from which I will do a random selection.
yeah.
But if I bring together people who don't know each other and I've drawn them out of say the Toronto phone directory, which doesn't exist anymore, I gather, uh, I can make a sortition and we'll have a conversation and decide on something. I don't know.
Yeah.
What shall we debate?
Yeah, no, I think you can. A lot of citizens' assemblies do partially do that. Like they will have one meeting in person, then go online, and then. But the thing is that one of the critical elements of what the the deliberation phase of a citizen assembly does is uh, is is to make sure that everyone joins in and that nobody dominates. And that's hard to do online. G.K. Chesterton has a line, which you probably saw at the beginning of my father's book. It's one of the introductory quotes of uh, democracy is the best democracy is about bringing the shy people out. And this is a very important principle. In fact, one of the great I was about to say goddess, but that's probably not one of the great new generation of writers on sortition, Helene Landemore of Yale University.
Yes.
She actually has made this a guiding principle of her next book of Politics Without Politicians, which I think is coming out in the coming next year or two.
I'm very
Bring it,
keen.
bring it.
I wanted to get her, by the way. I can't get her. It's just too.
I feel so lucky that she felt the same way as you did about my father's book and wrote the preface, which was a huge legitimation of what my father was trying to say. But the point is about how you get people to come to a consensual solution. Is a lot of it is about them being able to take the others into account. And the thing about, even with the most clever Zoom breaking up of everybody into subgroups of rooms and so forth, ultimately the personal interaction at some point, I think, is really important. But anyway, but your charms are clearly go beyond the computer screen. Yeah.
No, I mean, I haven't been out of my apartment, I think 5 times in the last 5 years. I do not go out anymore for health reasons, but
Hmm.
I've never had as happy and wonderful and rich a social life ever as I have in that 5 year period. So I'm very much a convinced believer in Zoom, and I would like to see if I can't apply that, because I think we could have even someday a world government run by people sitting in their own living rooms, or answering their cell phones while they're riding their bikes.
Yes, I'm sure people will find things, new ways to do everything. But I think as our discussion about democracy shows, I think there are some principles which never go away about how people run their lives. I mean, how the ancient Greeks sorted out the way human government works remains the same. They knew even back then, 2,000 years ago, that if you have elections, what you will get is an oligarchy. It's the iron law of oligarchy, as later political scientists put it.
Well, that's our dilemma right now, and
Mm,
this is such fun talking with you about this, because I'm really convinced that this is really the way forward. I don't know. There is a lingering suspicion in my mind that maybe nowadays life is so complicated that the really important questions are beyond the grasp of ordinary people. But somehow we've got to get past that problem, because I don't blame people for being, disappointed in the government, and even resenting the what they call elites, you
yes.
know.
I mean,
So,
just to go back to the French Assembly on euthanasia, just to give you an example of how this can work. So 185 people joined.
mhm,
Nine weekends later, and then 4 months later, there were still 184 of them. And the reason that they chose 185 originally was they assumed that 30 would drop out. Nobody did. Just one person who got a job in another continent had to go. The commitment that people were ready to give, thanks to the sense of common purpose and doing something for the common good, was extraordinary. And I'm sure that your long experience of life has shown you what I think I see is that people very easily split into two camps on almost any issue when they are left to their own devices, or when money starts playing a role. And that, as we see in the US system, where you have a razor edge between the two candidates, which makes no sense, because most people in the US have very similar interests. There's no need for people to be divided and polarized in two.
mhm.
And the same thing might have happened on the question of whether or not to allow people to have the right to decide to die early, to have an assisted suicide, or whatever you like to call it. And the certainly the great religions are all against it. There's a strong body of opinion in the care community that the people's wish to commit suicide is driven not by pain or whatever, but sometimes by loneliness, or by the fact that they feel they're a financial burden on their family, or that they can no longer do things themselves, no longer autonomous. And the care community, as they spoke to the assembly, were very convincing that if people feel loved and taken and genuinely embraced by their families, by the state, by the cities where they live, then they are much less likely to want to commit suicide, and so forth. Anyway, there's an enormous number of factors that need to be taken into account, but it's worth spending 5 million euros as it cost them, 4.5 million euros that it cost them, because 700,000 people a year are dying in France. And many of them face this question at the end. And of course, we all face this question at the end. And so if it costs that much money to get a good legal framework, so be it. And the fact that politically chosen people couldn't do it because it would be a polarizing thing to make a public statement about, that you might lose a few percent of your voting points if you took a position one way or the other. The system of getting to know each other, in being informed by 60 experts, spending 2 weekends deliberating with people that you've got to know and got to trust, meant that when push came to shove, at the point where you have to decide what to recommend, 75% of the Citizens' Assembly voted for the idea that assisted suicide should be made possible. Now, the 25% that were against assisted suicide didn't go off in a huff and brief against this decision and try and delegitimize or anything. They all, I believe, all signed the document, and the evening after it was adopted, even people who had in the assembly been quite staunchly pro-life, if you like, that had not wanted to euthanasia to be allowed, went on national television in France to support the recommendation that euthanasia be allowed, because within their report, all the points of view of the carers, the religions, had been taken into account, and the context had been made safe, as it were, for everybody. And I find that totally remarkable, considering what the kind of divisiveness that decision-making seems to produce in our representative government system.
I agree totally. That is exactly the most impressive reason for promoting it, and I'm heartily promoting it, as you obviously are too. So it's been a joy to get to know you a little bit. Now I feel, even though I haven't been in your living room and you haven't been in mine, that we now have I trust you.
Yeah.
So thank you, and I'll be back in touch with you in the near future about showing a conversation about your new job and the occupation, the organization you're with now. So thank you. It's been fun.